The Spanish GP has concluded as start of the triple header in June, and aside from an electric fire, pretty fractured Alpine and Renault relationship, potential police investigation, there were a few conclusions to draw from the race this weekend, and that gives a reason to be optimistic for some, while it is a reality check for others. In this video, I'm going to discuss strategies, driver head-to-heads, lap times, and the important moments leading up to the race. So if you're curious about all that, stay tuned. So starting with the track itself, the circuit has medium to high speed characteristics. This is what teams have adapted to as well. There were two teams bringing major upgrades this weekend, but RB's upgrades didn't really pay off. They had a different floor edge, more exposed of the floor actually, with their side pod undercut. They were expecting to be quicker by 2 to 2.5 tenths, but they were, well, relatively slower to everybody else, well, except for Williams, I guess. So safe to say that they haven't really found harmony with this upgrade. The other major upgrade was brought in by Ferrari, who were hoping to get closer to Red Bull and McLaren. Instead, they are still a teeny bit behind Mercedes, at least in this weekend. The track layout has changed since 2023, since the last chicane was removed, and therefore the track concludes 14 corners altogether. Another important thing to note is that finally Sargeant was running on the lighter chassis this race, so my expectations were pretty high, and unfortunately he didn't deliver. But before I get into that, let's look at another driver who was running on a lighter chassis, and that was Esteban Ocon, who is basically rotating his chassis between himself and Gasly, and who was not better than Gasly, so that's also an interesting point for the weekend. So before I get into the race itself, let's look at the important moments that led up to it. So all throughout the three practices, Norris seemed pretty fast, and he was substantially ahead of his teammate. So was Verstappen, so I would say that throughout the whole weekend, Red Bull and McLaren were really fighting only with one of their drivers. Ferrari and Mercedes seemed to be close, although Leclerc was struggling with some issues in the first free practice, which he seemed to have sorted out for the last one. But again, not a huge gain on Mercedes in total. What we could see from these long runs in free practices is that the soft tire really didn't degrade all that much compared to the harder compounds. So you would not gain a lot of time by using the hard compound for a longer stint during the race, simply because, again, tire degradation wasn't that significant on the softs. So both Norris and Verstappen seem to be really quick and consistent on their long runs in terms of medium compounds. The only team where we could see some slight degradation happening out of the four big teams was Mercedes. So I was really curious to see whether that would replicate in the race as well. But as we could see, it did not. So the conclusion is degradation was pretty okay for the top teams at least. We could already see that RB was washed, and unfortunately that did not change later on either. Williams seemed to be bad except for the last free practice, but that was just false hope, it seems. Maybe Albon was running on lower fuel at the time. I don't know, but it was definitely not convincing all throughout the weekend. In terms of Alpine, they were showing a lot of promise, and fortunately, they could capitalize on that the day after. And the last important thing that happened throughout free practice is that we had two reprimanded drivers. Leclerc was driving a bit too hot-headed after being impeded by Norris. They had contact, but eventually he didn't receive any penalties because it was free practice. I'm not sure that that's a right reasoning for it. I think in the future they really should not differentiate between sessions, rather between actions, because if a rookie comes in and he does the same thing, this really doesn't set a great precedent for anybody new to come in or anybody who is already a little too aggressive at times, like Magnussen. Apologies, Magnussen fans. So yeah, I'm hoping that this will be penalized a bit harsher in the future. So heading into quali and specifically to Q1, both Williams were out by a pretty far margin compared to Hamilton. Sargeant was a lot more than a second away, and Albon was around a second too. Aside from that, the RBs had a really disappointing result as well, being 8 and 9 tenths off of the leader in Q1. The positives were that both Alpines were through. Hulkenberg was again performing really well, and kick Saubers, they weren't out in Q1, so that was a great performance considering their last few quali results this year. Anyways, let's get to Q2. Q2 was incredibly disappointing for the Aston Martin drivers as both of them were out. Alpine again marching to Q3, and what an incredible result. Unfortunately, kick Saubers were out, but it is worth to note that Bottas had a really big gap ahead of his teammate, and I don't think this was Joe's best quali performance, to put it mildly. So then in Q3, one notable thing that happened is Piastri didn't manage to set a time. He made a mistake in his first attempt and in his second attempt as well, as he went too wide. Now I looked at his sectors for his last attempt and he was losing too much. He probably would have finished ahead of Perez and the Alpines at the end hadn't it been for the mistake, but to challenge Ferrari and Mercedes, that would have been a tough feat. And yeah, he was far off of Norris and Verstappen as well. And looking at the fact that Piastri's strong suit so far has been qualifying, he definitely didn't perform that well in Barcelona. Most important of all, Gasly managed to qualify 7th ahead of Sergio Perez, which is incredible. He was within half a second to Norris, who eventually won the session. So I mean, kudos to Alpine. His teammate was, I think, about 2/10 off of him. So Gasly's performance in general, I think, was one of the peaks of this session. Now talking about Norris and Verstappen, Norris was incredible in the second sector, and basically that is what provided him his win. Not that he had such a big margin ahead of Max, but yeah, his pace in the second sector was definitely something else. A bit of a disappointment for Ferrari, I suppose, because they both qualified behind the Mercedes drivers, even if not by a lot, but I'm sure that they were hoping for something better this weekend. So with that said, let's look into the teammate head-to-head specifically for this weekend. Right, so on the table on my right, you can see the last session that both teammates have participated in, or rather set a time in, as we know that Piastri participated in Q3, he just failed to set a time. And you can see the respective gaps between all of the drivers sorted from the biggest to the smallest gap. And the first thing that you can see is that huge difference between Verstappen and Perez, which was about 6.5 tenths. Other big margins were between Bottas and Joe and Albon and Sargeant. I know that both Williams struggled, but again, the difference between them is not looking great for Sargeant overall. The closest were Hamilton and Russell, basically setting almost identical times in Q3. So kudos to both of them. And this time around, we had the RB drivers very close as well, although that really didn't help either of them out at the session. But at least we know that is what the car was capable of during this quali session. Now, one might wonder where the difference between Bottas and Joe really originates from, and I'd say that looking at their individual sectors, Bottas was a lot faster in the last sector than Joe, and the majority of his advantage comes from that. And in terms of the Max Checo difference, Checo was lower in all of the sectors, especially in sector 2 and 3, getting 2 tenths, 2.5 tenths sometimes. That was his undoing at the end of the day. Now we're done with qualifying. We're kind of aware of the power structure. We know that it's going to be between Max and Lando, and there will be a fight between Mercedes and Ferrari. About the race start itself, Russell had an amazing start with a massive tow as he overtook both Norris and Verstappen, and Hamilton didn't really have the best of starts, so that added to Russell's advantage. And obviously Max and Lando were pretty occupied with one another at the time. Now, what was crucial here is that Max overtook Russell, I think around lap 3, whilst Norris was stuck behind until George went for his new medium tires, and that is where Norris's race win was basically lost, and I think he admitted that. So what happened here, and let's look at the strategies briefly. So the most typical strategy, and this was forecasted as the most optimal strategy, which was the case actually, was going from softs to mediums and then ending on softs again. Not everybody elected that strategy, even though pre-practice I think insinuated this highly that softs would be pretty durable during the race itself, and so it was. Therefore, most definitely soft to medium soft was the better strategy this weekend. Everybody started on the softs, by the way, except for Albon, who was trying something different starting from the pit lane, and this is what I I've noticed with Williams sometimes is that with their alternative strategies, they don't really take advantage of it. So because their tire degradation is so significant, they cannot have a longer stint than the rest of the drivers, and therefore the advantage that they are trying to get from that alternative strategy is basically lost. And I think that again happened to Albon this time around. So there was a group of drivers, and especially in the second half of the grid, who started on softs, but they had a pretty short stint, then went out for mediums or softs again and continued on hards for a long time. They were very slow at the end, I think, and also, as we could see, Bottas lost a lot of places all throughout the race, so it was not the most optimal strategy. So why did Norris lose that race win? I mentioned this about Max overtaking Russell, and so the problem there was that Norris, although he was faster on soft tires both at the beginning of the race and at the end, he really couldn't capitalize on that given that he was behind Russell all that time. And so the difference between Norris's and Verstappen's average lap times is pretty small, and for a really long time Verstappen had an advantage over Norris in the first stint, just because he was driving in clean air and he wasn't stuck at all. Both Norris and Leclerc had a longer stint on those soft compounds. That did not pay off for Norris again for set reasons. He was quicker on the mediums, no questions about that. He had about, I think, 4/10 of an advantage over Max, which wasn't enough because he was losing a lot actually at the beginning of Max's medium stint, as he was way faster than Norris at that time on the softs. The other thing is that is important to note that yes, Verstappen went on the softs earlier than Norris did at the end of the race, but his softs were brand new. So virtually his tires were as fresh as Norris's. And yes, despite that, we could see that Norris was faster, but not fast enough to overtake him over the short stint that they had at the end of the race. Looking at teammates as well, I think it's worth mentioning that Norris and Piastri were far off of each other in terms of their lap times in the first soft stint. I think Piastri got about half a second behind Norris in terms of his lap times. And the same can be said about Perez and Verstappen again. Perez, although he starts strong at the beginning of his tire stints, but then he fluctuates a lot. Not only that, he loses time. So his tires, I suppose, degraded a whole lot more than Verstappen's for some reason. And Norris was better on the mediums as well than Piastri. I think at the end, when they were both put on soft slow fuel, they were similar, but again, the first two stints, that was really not good for Piastri. Hamilton and Russell were setting almost identical lap times on the soft compounds, but with the strategical advantage that Hamilton had, it was never a question that he would finish ahead of Russell. Now, a shout out to Pierre Gasly, who was setting very consistent lap times on his hard compound, and yes, Perez was faster on those soft tires, but I think Gasly perhaps could have stayed ahead had it been for that atrocious pit stop that was about 6 seconds or longer, I think, actually. But definitely an amazing drive from him. One thing that was slightly strange to me, and just again showcased how bad Williams were, that Albon and Ricciardo, they were setting the same lap times, but Albon was on softs, and I said this before, that because softs were not degrading all that much, they offered all the time advantage that you could ask for, and in this case, it wasn't giving Albon any advantages. He lost his car for a little bit at the end as well, so it was very sensitive to wind and degradation altogether. And lastly, because I think that this weekend was a weekend of slow pit stops, Norris also had a pretty slow one, at least according to McLaren standards, so he lost some time there. But in conclusion, I can say, looking at the lap times, looking at quali, and looking at Norris's interview as well, that Norris was the fastest driver this weekend. Despite that, he did not win, which again shows how incredible Max's performance was this case. What are the conclusions ahead of the Austrian GP? Alpine, they look really good, and hopefully, because Barcelona is a traditional circuit, this is going to be a good sign for them to continue into the next two sessions of the triple header. Perez still looks washed, and I hope that he picks up the pace, because at this stage, the constructors is not sealed and delivered. Max is not going to be able to win it by himself this time, because he doesn't have the fastest car always, as we have seen in previous weekends. So Perez's performance is going to be crucial at the end. And to that, I would like to add, there is not a lot of emphasis on Piastri's performance, as he's usually a lot closer to Norris, at least on a one lap, but Piastri needs to pick up his pace as well. He's far off of his teammate at this point, and the constructors is on, so they will need Piastri to perform better a little bit as well. Mercedes seemingly are on the right trajectory as well in the last 2 weekends. They have been performing incredible ahead of Ferrari for sure, so that's a warning sign for Ferrari, because they can lose that advantage as quickly as it came ahead of Mercedes. Norris and Leclerc are very close in terms of points, but if Mercedes keep getting better and better relatively to Ferrari, that point gap is going to extend, and Leclerc will not really have a chance to finish ahead of Norris in the Drivers' Championship this year. Notable change in the constructors. Alpine with this performance actually got ahead of HAAS. HAAS is technically carried by only one driver, and that's going to be an issue going forward if they want to compete with Alpine. You can see that, yeah, Red Bull, they're grabbing points, but proportionally, they haven't been that strong for some time. And McLaren and Mercedes, they are picking those points up, and that's going to be crucial in the constructors, as I mentioned before. And finally, my driver of the day. Now, this is a little fishy to me, and I don't know if you have any explanations to it. I haven't looked into it, but every single time it is guaranteed that Norris is going to be driver of the day. And don't get me wrong, he is an exceptionally good driver this year, but he's not the driver of every Sunday, at least not for me. And I think in this case especially, my driver of the day actually was Verstappen, who I think at this point needs to cross the checkered flag backwards, because I don't know what he needs to do to be voted as driver of the day. But in this case, I would choose him. Or if not him, then Gasly or Hamilton, because Gasly's performance was convincing. He had a bit of a margin ahead of his teammate, and if it is indeed the case that Ocon was running with the lighter chassis, then especially kudos to him for his performance. And Hamilton again proved, I think, especially in qualifying, that yeah, he hasn't lost the pace either. So that's it from my side. I hope you enjoy this format. I may have missed a few things, so please let me know in the comment section, and see you after Austria.